University of Oxford. I would ask you to put your mics on mute. We have some exceptional speakers for the next hour. The topic is war and psychiatry. I'm going to give a brief introduction to each of these speakers now, and therefore when we start, we can go straight into their talks. So Dr. Jeya Balakrishna is a community psychiatrist in defence primary healthcare. He did look after British forces, a former infantry medical officer. He worked in forensic and general services in the NHS and in the independent sector, and he's worked actively in coaching and mentoring numerous people, also working as an honorary consultant for combat stress. Professor Edgar Jones is an authority on the psychological effects of modern war and conflict. He studies both conventional armed forces and terrorism, exploring how individuals cope during periods of intense stress and the impact of traumatic experiences on their well-being. Both are going to be speaking for about 20-25 minutes with about 5 or 10 minutes for questions. So overall, we have 2 half-hour slots. It's going to be a very special meeting. I know you'll have lots of questions. You can, if you can, hold them, please, till the discussion. We'll try and get through as many questions as possible. Also, when you are asked to offer a question, please, can we ask a precise, short question? We won't have much time for long speeches or any particular commentaries at this point, but there's no problem in terms of contacting Edgar and Jeya afterwards if there are more discussion points to be had. So without further ado, I've just forgotten who was going to go first. Was it Jeya or Edgar?
I think you asked me, Cam.
Edgar, far away, Edgar. Yeah, brilliant. Welcome. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you. First slide, please. I really appreciate being asked. And I should say at the outset, this is a study that Cam and I have worked on with others. So this is not just my work. Cam played a really important part in this. Next slide, please. During times of crisis or recruitment difficulties, the British have a tradition of turning to former imperial territories for frontline staff. And you can see in World War II, for example, India contributed 2.5 million men and women in support of the British war effort. But I want to draw your attention to the poster on the side. We know it was produced in the Second World War. We don't know exactly where. And it's supposed to be a symbol of unity and everyone working together. But if we look at it more carefully, the front rank shows a British sailor, an Australian infantryman, and a Canadian airman. And tucked right at the back, almost out of view, is an African soldier and a Sikh infantryman in the British Indian Army. Strictly speaking, the Sikh should be at the front alongside the British sailor because Indian troops contributed more than the combined total of Australian, Canadian, New Zealand and South African troops. And they fought in every major theatre of the war. And so this poster produced at the time reveals the inherent bias and prejudice that acted at the time. Next slide, please. Since 1945, the UK Armed Forces have continued to recruit from ethnic minority populations whenever again they face a manpower shortage. And they tend to use the same management techniques and recruitment models that were used in times of empire. And just to illustrate that, today we have 4,000 Nepalese soldiers serving in the British Army's Brigade of Gurkhas, and at least 2,000 Fijians in other units. Next slide, please. And this recourse to former Commonwealth and countries and Nepal is largely because UK ethnic populations don't feel a sense of belonging in the current armed forces. A survey, for example, in 2002 of Punjabi Sikhs and Muslims living in Britain found that a historic record of discrimination in terms of promotion, access to status roles, leadership, had led them to believe that they didn't belong, and they turned to further education for a worthwhile career. Next slide, please. In 1996, an Office of Public Management revealed endemic racism in UK's armed forces, and the threat of non-discrimination notice was only lifted when the Ministry of Defence agreed to work with the Commission of Racial Equality to implement a 5-year plan for equality across the 3 services. And I've put up a recruitment poster there from 1969, and people have described the British Army as a boys' club, but you can see there it was a white boys' club. Next slide, please. So in 1998, the Strategic Defence Review, oops, screen's gone black, revealed that UK armed forces had really failed to recruit from ethnic minority groups. They were 6% of the British population at the time, but only 1% of service personnel. And more generally in British society, the Macpherson Report of 1999 identified institutional racism in public sector institutions. And so that gave impetus to the process of trying to make the armed forces more diverse. And the military set themselves the goal of increasing ethnic minority populations by 1% per annum from 1998 onwards. Next slide, please. They failed to recruit from the UK population. Bit of a feedback. And so again, they turned, as in the First and Second World War, to the Commonwealth and Nepal, and succeeded in 2012 in reaching those targets when ethnic minority population was 7.1%. And although that sounds good, there's an element of discrimination, because you can see that only 2.4% of officers were from ethnic minorities, compared with 8% in other ranks. And equally, those that were joining were tending to go into the frontline infantry units, where they represented around 10%, where they had a limited range of transferable skills. And you can see there a picture of Fijian soldiers who found themselves in infantry units, and I've interviewed a couple of Fijian soldiers, and they said that they felt they were chosen for their endurance, their physical strength, but however hard they tried, it was very difficult for them to get promoted. Next slide, please. It's still the case that UK armed forces recruit from Commonwealth nations in ways that reflect imperial patterns. They're so deeply embedded. So today, there are 15,300 ethnic minority service personnel. It's up to 11.2%. But again, only 3.3% are officers, 13.1% are other ranks. So you can see that they're not working their way through promotion to leadership roles. And also, again, they remain concentrated in the army, where they'll be found primarily in the infantry, in one of the most dangerous jobs where there are significant shortages. And of those, of the 15,000, 41% have not yet attained citizenship rights. Next slide, please. So our study, funded by Forces in Mind Trust, we set off working on this in April 2023. We sought to identify embedded cultural practice and beliefs about the deployment of ethnic minority servicemen in UK forces, and the extent to which those beliefs continue to influence the management of soldiers in terms of their terms and conditions. So if discrimination continues to exist, does it have an impact on mental health and well-being? Next slide, please. One thing we identified was that Britain, having had imperial ambitions, was compelled to recruit troops from the territories that they subjugated. It's a small island population. If you want to establish a hegemony in India, you have no alternative but to engage with the local population and recruit particular groups in the imperial project. So from 1857 onwards, the British tried to identify what they thought were martial races and engage them by giving them slightly better terms and conditions, that they become bought into this imperial project. And you can see here they particularly chose the Sikhs, who'd fought 2 wars against the British in the 1840s and virtually won the first and should have won the second, and the Gurkhas, who they failed to defeat when they invaded their territory. because they could see that these were resilient, military skilled populations. Next slide, please. So during World Wars I and II, two key narratives framed the interpretation and treatment of Indian and Gurkha soldiers. The first is that they experienced no fear before or during battle because of their innate warrior qualities. And secondly, distress associated with wounds or extended periods of combat was expressed largely in bodily terms rather than in anxiety states or depression. Next slide, please. And the reason why British psychiatrists and commanders offered this cultural explanation for, they offered a cultural explanation for this apparent absence of fear before or during or after combat. Their idea was that military service in general, battle in particular, were activities which the Indian soldier was expected to enjoy. And they explained this by saying they were farmers, they were accustomed to poverty, a hard standard of living, and this physical hardship had developed an innate resilience that built on their natural skills as soldiers. And that gave them an excuse to reduce levels of psychiatric services. And these were, as we'll see, relatively minimal compared with what was offered to the British troops fighting in the same theatre. And very rarely in World War I and World War II were Indian soldiers diagnosed with anxiety states or depression in comparison to their British counterparts. Next slide, please. And as a result, they received a much lower level of care. So if we look at, say, the 26th Indian Division, only 100 Indian soldiers were treated in its forward psychiatric unit compared with 145 British soldiers. And that doesn't sound like a big difference until we realize that 80% of the troops in the division were Indian. Captain Miller, attached to the 20th Indian Division, says, I made a point of seeing all British cases admitted to the field ambulance, but I had very little time to see all the Indian cases. And again, Gurkha and Indians were 80% of that division. Next slide, please. Sorry, back one. British psychiatrists argued that Indian and Gurkha troops expressed when they were distressed in somatic form rather than in psychological illness. And when Indian troops did come forward with large numbers of somatic cases, they tended to dismiss that as poor morale rather than combat stress. Next slide, please. And I just quickly wanted to mention a study we did of British troops in the Second World War, and we followed them up using war pension files from the 1940s to the 1970s. All of them had a diagnosis for a psychological disorder. And what we discovered is that virtually all of them, a very, very high percentage, had physical somatic symptoms as well. You can see in this list dyspepsia, stomach pain, muscle pain, shortness of breath, irregular heartbeat, weakness, weight changes. So I just wanted to make the point that this argument that Indian and Gurkha troops have a propensity to somatic pain is in a sense no different to British troops as well. And I think it gives them a kind of an excuse not to address the psychological symptoms. Next slide, please. And if we move to beyond the Second World War, we can see Colonel Cross here, who served in a Gurkha regiment from 1944 to 1972. He says Gurkha troops served hardships with no grumbling, no illness. So it's possible that there's a culture and an expectation of resilience which may have inhibited the report of psychological symptoms, not least in an environment where Gurkhas sought to prove themselves as being better than British infantry. Next slide, please. There were some British psychiatrists who'd taken the trouble to study the language and get to know the culture. And Major Pacheco, for example, in 1948 described differences in mental states, saying depression more common in Indian soldiers, British troops were more at greater risk of anxiety states. So there were some who took a more nuanced view of mental states. Next slide, please. So these deeply embedded beliefs about the innate resilience of troops from India and the Commonwealth influenced the terms under which they were hired. So today, a Commonwealth soldier wounded and discharged before completing 4 years service was not allowed to work or claim benefits in the UK. Commonwealth soldiers were not entitled to compassionate leave should a close family emergency occur when they were serving in Iraq or Afghanistan. Whereas a British soldier was allowed compassionate leave without forfeiting pay. Next slide, please. By 2007, Commonwealth service personnel described themselves as being treated like third-class soldiers, and they set up the British Commonwealth Soldiers Union. By this time, the numbers were up between 2,000 to 6,000, of whom 2,000 were Fijians, and they were mainly committed to serving 22 years to qualify for an army pension. Next slide, please. Freedom of information requests to the MOD revealed at least 15 Fijian soldiers applied for compensation for PTSD between 2005 and 15. And this was a qualitative PhD, which showed that Commonwealth soldiers found a more negative experience in the army than a comparison group of white, foreign, and Commonwealth peers, and a diminished ability to influence decisions about their working life, and that the organisation was inhibiting their career progression. Next slide, please. And this is a final bit of research before we started. This was done down at Combat Stress, semi-structured interviews of 6 Commonwealth veterans who reported feeling unheard when reaching out for help, believed that they were regarded differently to the white British veterans and not really understood by mental health professions. Next slide, please. So a Defence Committee report into 2019 showed that 39% of complaints from ethnic minorities for discrimination compared with 24% against white personnel. So there does seem to be an increased concern amongst the ethnic population in the British Army that they are experiencing discrimination. Next slide, please. So this is our study. We recruited 25 Gurkha veterans, 14 Fijian veterans, and interviewed them with a semi-structured questionnaire. We also had a quantitative study taking samples, random samples from the King Centre for Military Health Research. Next slide, please. So these are our key findings from the narrative study. The most important issue, and it's the issue where virtually every Gurkha we interviewed of the 25, and I conducted 21 of these, were concerned and distressed about the enduring Gurkha pension parity. So any Gurkha serving before 1997, his pension is paid at between 23 and 36% of the value of a British veteran. Next slide, please. And this issue becomes particularly significant after 2009 because the UK government permits Gurkha veterans who served before 1997 to apply for indefinite leave to remain in the UK. So they come to the UK, they bring their families, and they encounter significant financial hardship because their pension is paying at 1/3 of the rate of a UK veteran. And you can see there have been 2 hunger strikes, which reflect the depth of feeling and upset about this key issue. Next slide, please. The other issue is the barrier to citizenship. The cost, both Commonwealth and Gurkha veterans have the right to apply for citizenship, but you can see the cost is really significant, up to almost £3,000 for each person, including wife and children. And they have to serve a minimum of 4 years to be eligible unless they're discharged for injury or illness attributed to their military role. Next slide, please. Gurkha and Fijian veterans, again, across the population, recorded barriers to promotion and restricted access to non-infantry roles. I recall speaking to one veteran who said he came to the UK as a qualified police officer. He was a few years older than the typical British recruit. He was physically stronger, fitter, outperformed in marching, sort of campaign exercises, but was repeatedly refused the junior leaders course. Access to a commission was almost exclusively through the late entry officer scheme, having to work your way through all the way up to sergeant or warrant officer. And very often, Gurkhas would run out of time in their military career before they could get promoted beyond the rank of lieutenant. And even to this day, those barriers have now been lifted. I think we've only seen one or two Gurkhas rise to lieutenant colonel. Next slide, please. Overt narratives about mental health were limited in scope, but when I was interviewing veterans, it was clear that many were feeling distress and sadness. Some had tears in their eyes when they spoke of discrimination during military service. Research published in Nepal has found that a whole range of diverse idioms of distress are used to express psychological trauma, including bodily pain. But the Gurkhas I'd interviewed said most of them had only recently learned of PTSD, and that they were the younger veterans. So it may well be that a culture which emphasizes resilience, combined with a wish not to appear as a victim, may have restricted Gurkha and Fijian veterans' narratives about depression or post-traumatic illness. What we have seen from the quantitative study is that Gurkha and Fijian soldiers were no more likely to express somatic symptoms than white British officers. I looked at the numbers. There's quite a lot of muscle pain, joint pain, back pain, which you can understand coming from soldiers, pain in knees, and the levels are pretty much similar in both the Gurkhas, the Fijians, the Commonwealth soldiers, the white British, and the UK ethnic minority service personnel. So my feeling is that the idea that Commonwealth soldiers are more prone to report somatic symptoms is probably a bias. Next slide, please. Final slide. So same term from 2007 onwards, Commonwealth and Gurkha service personnel have been employed under the same terms and conditions of UK-born soldiers, and they now receive the same pensions.
Like now?
Yeah, it doesn't impact me though. Like,
okay.
the girl who replaced me is still staying.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's not my problem.
Also, access to UK citizenship has been eased
Wow,
for
imagine
Commonwealth
being such a
soldiers,
patriot to move out.
Yeah.
but
middle of the
remains
year.
costly. Formal barriers to promotion have been listed, but they're yet to result in significant change.
That mean?
So
I
my
don't know how
conclusion
to
really is that the legacy of empire is deeply rooted and continues to impact, albeit at a reduced level, on the mental health and well-being of ethnic minority veterans. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Edgar. That was brilliant. That was really brilliant. I'd seen some of that data before, but not all of it. And the story you tell is really impressive. Well done. Thank you for that. So are there any questions that people want to ask? If you use the hand up function, I can't see everybody, so you can't put your hand up and I may not spot it. Has anyone got any questions or comments that you want to make? Edgar, I'll ask a question then if I can't, if no one else has one. It's really challenging, you know, and I guess the discrimination is known. Oh, there is one question. I'll come to you in a moment, Susie. Why would they join anyway? Can you just help us understand what was encouraging them to join?
It's partly poverty. It's partly looking for an opportunity, a broader opportunity. The Gurkhas are recruited from a hill population where there is subsistence farming, there's no medical services, and there's a tradition going back to the early 19th century. And a lot of them said they're following in a sort of family tradition, and the pay that they'll get from the British Army and the money they can send home is significantly more than what they will have in their communities. So there's a sense in which they are seeking to better themselves. They know it's going to be tough, but there's the promise of a greater opportunity. And when you return, and in the old days, when you went back to Nepal, the pension you had was sufficient to live on.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Susie, you had a question. Do you want to put your camera on and say hello and tell us who you are?
Hello, I don't know if you can see me. Yes, you can.
Yes,
Hello,
yes.
Professor Edgar. Hello, everybody.
Hi.
It wasn't a question. It's lovely to see you, Professor. It's not a question as such. It's just an observation, really. I worked many years ago during the sort of the height of the intensity of operations in Afghanistan and at the end of Iraq, and I was sort of sent in to provide sort of frontline, first line psychological support to the casualties coming back, which you will remember with most horrific, life-changing, and in some cases ending injuries. And I recall, when we had Fijian and Nepalese soldiers admitted, sort of feeling a sense of hopelessness initially because of the manifestation, as you've just so eloquently described, Professor. It took me right back to those moments where I thought, gosh, how am I going to help these guys who really struggled, who were really challenged in terms of being able to articulate their psychological pain, but conversely, they often had very deep religious faiths, and so for me there was that balance. On one hand, they were unlikely to talk, unlike their sort of white British counterparts, about the fact that they'd been sitting next to their commanding officer who'd been blown up in the vehicle, and they felt that level of burden and responsibility. But actually, they found their sort of I suppose their peace with their religion. And so but I thought it was really important to make that point, because it sort of chimes with what you've been describing in terms of the nuances. And I think that as mental health professionals, we sometimes could be better at understanding their frame of reference and their position. I think we could be better in sort of military mental health services. But that was lovely, and obviously great to see you, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I attended a Fijian church service as a way of getting to meet Fijian veterans in a relaxed, easy manner. And I was struck by the strength of their religious feeling and their commitment to their faith. And I could see that was very important in seeing them through difficult times.
Indeed. I suppose the other point to make is, though, that tragically we know that they also become victims of this dreadful thing called suicide, and we've had across the British Army, I can say, deaths by suicide amongst the Nepalese and Fijian communities, which is another conversation altogether, of course. But thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Susie. Thank you. Any other questions or comments from anybody? If not, we'll move on and maybe give ourselves a couple of extra minutes, and we can bring Edgar back in if there are questions which are common to both presentations. Just checking there's nobody else. Yeah, okay, let's move on then. Thanks ever so much, Edgar. That's fabulous. Thank you so much. So over to you, Dr. Jeya Balakrishna, for your presentation. Far away. Thank you.
Yep, Cam, thanks very much. I'm going to rely on Rasheen to share, and hopefully we get it. Yes, here we are. Slide view. Super. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Cam, for hosting this meeting. It's wonderful. I'm going to be talking about reservists in the UK Armed Forces. Reservists, well, I say two jobs. Some reservists have had more than two jobs, about the challenge of balancing civilian and military careers. Next slide, please. And I'm going to talk about a little bit of history, just very little, but focus on the different experiences between reservists and regulars in UK Armed Forces. And one of my roles in my day job, working as a civilian consultant psychiatrist, is leading the National Reserve's mental health program. So I'll just mention that, and I'll finish off with some implications for clinical practice. Next slide, please. So a little bit of a history here. By the end of World War I, Royal Navy Volunteer Reserves was standing at 70,000. The territorial force was 1 million. And by the Auxiliary Air Force was created in 1924, conferred so it became Royal in 1947, King George VI for the World War II service. By 1942, the number of Royal Navy reservists were equal to the number of Royal Navy regulars. And in 1958, there was a merger between the Royal Navy Volunteer Reserves with the Royal Navy Reserve, because there were two groups that were created at the time. They came together as one to be the Royal Navy Reserves. Next slide, please. Just a little bit more in terms of mobilizations. Iraq and Afghanistan reservist deployments peaked around 2004. 20% of the forces in Iraq, 12% of the those deployed to Afghanistan were reservists across the three services. By 2008, 2,300 were mobilized annually worldwide. The Territorial Army was renamed the Army Reserve in 2013. More recent activity that we've seen our reservists in the 2012 Olympics, which was in London, hosted in London, and Op Rescript, which relates to the military involvement in COVID-19 pandemic arrangements in the UK. It was in the period of 2020-21. So next slide, please. As I mentioned, COVID, I just thought I'd share a little photograph. It's in the public domain. People might have seen this, but this is one of the red arrows leading the other red arrows. And clearly you can imagine it's one of the pilots in the aircraft behind. And really, this was actually taken at the time of the pandemic. I forget now. I think it was either late 2020 or early 2021. It shows London Heathrow Airport, and with all aircraft grounded. And so I just thought I'd share quite a striking photograph of one of the busiest airports in the world, if not actually the busiest, being absolutely quiet. But there you go. Next slide, please. So, reservist and regular. A part-time SP, it's service personnel, but well, sort of part-time in the sense they're not. It's not their full-time job generally, as compared to the regular. The reservist would typically have a civilian day job. Of course, they have their family, you know, whether they're in a family where they're married or have a partner, or you know, their family with their parents. The family, in as far as regulars are concerned, are typically part of the military life, somewhat embedded into the military community. For the reservists, more often than not, the reservists enjoy every opportunity. They thrive in it. To get into exercise, to get deployment, to get into events, you know, going on annual camps or going on regimental dinners. Of course, regulars have the same pride as well. It is part of their everyday life. It's their day job. It's their regular job. They live and breathe the military, as do their family, but they're part of a military family. So next slide, please. And this is just a description about the Reserves mental health program that I am leading. I started out with this in Chilwell, which is Chetwynd Barracks in Nottingham, and then we moved to Colchester Garrison in Essex around about 2016. And largely what we are focused on with the program is what we call the non-mobilized, the part-time reservists who are not mobilized. The program is available to any reservist who has deployed on operations since January 1982. We're mindful, of course, that there are reservists who could well have been ex-regulars, and there are indeed many who are ex-regulars who then go on to become reservists. And we are cognizant, and in fact, policy was revised in the last 5 years to ensure that we did not miss the psychological experiences of ex-regulars becoming reservists, so that in the reservists with past regular experience who might have had unrecognized or unrevealed mental health problems during the regular service and then becoming manifest in the reservist time, we felt it was important to pick that up. We've also incorporated into the program what we call the full-time reserve service, FTRS, both home commitment and limited commitment. These groups of home commitment and limited commitment generally do not deploy or deploy to a limited extent. And the idea is that we felt it was important to ensure some parity of healthcare, mental health care for those in an FTRS position, and to try and ensure that they were given some service alongside being registered with the NHS. Full commitment FTRS, who do exist, have similar access to healthcare as do the regulars and reserves who are mobilized. And then there are the university reservists. I think I'll say a bit about that now. Next slide, please. The UK universities, and this is a university platform, have military clubs, and the members of the clubs are they're treated as reservists. And the expectation when they've joined the clubs is that in the completion of their undergraduate degrees, they would go on to complete officer training in one of the services, Army, Navy, or Air Force, if they choose to do so. And it's usually an expectation. And I won't go through all those abbreviations, but there's just sort of the broad scheme of the broad number of schemes that exist for reservists under the undergrad arrangements. My mental health program covers for these students, recognizing, of course, they are registered with NHS GP, campus healthcare, etc., who are the front line for healthcare. But where our leaders who are looking after these clubs get in touch with me and say, we're concerned about an undergrad who might be running into some difficulties. Jeya, would you help? I'd say, yes, I will. And they're not large numbers that have come to our attention, but every now and again, I do make the time to have a conversation, a consultation, if we can call it that, really just to assist and then to do some signposting, but just to ensure that they get some top level input and not struggle while they're in university. So I thought I'd share that bit because I think it's quite useful, and given that we're presenting in a university platform, useful to know. Next slide, please. So what we know about from research about the reservists, deployed reserves, especially after Iraq, 2003, 2005, had higher rates of common mental disorders like mood disorders, anxiety, depression, and adjustment disorders than the non-deployed reserves and the deployed regulars. So it's quite interesting that the reservists were in research showing up higher rates than the deployed regulars. Reserves had less problems with alcohol after tours than the regular counterparts. I mean, there's some nuances to some of that research. I won't go into that. This is not so much an empirical presentation. It's far more qualitative and, sort of account from a frontline clinician, looking after patients on a day-to-day basis. But I just put some references there to help. Next slide, please. I thought this was useful, and this will be familiar to our researchers who do a lot of work for UK Armed Forces in King's College with the King's Centre for Military Health Research, adapted from our United States counterparts. Mulligan et al. Have put together this very useful schematic to help us understand what goes on during operational tour and how that translates in terms of a mindset or a range of experiences from being in an operational theater, a theater of operation, out in Afghanistan or Iraq, for example, and then returning home, the column on the right, to, let's say, pushing a shopping trolley in the local Tesco. And it's battle mind. You can see the acronym, is the word battle mind is actually in red letters on the left-hand column all the way down. So each letter leads off a row. And I won't go through every single one, but I've always found this as a clinician a very useful conversation tool, especially when I'm dealing with serving personnel, whether regular or reservists, who are presenting potentially with psychological trauma as a consequence of their experiences on operational tour. And I find that it's useful to actually put this up or share it on a sheet of paper and talk through some of the symptoms they're having and trying to link it back to what their roles or their expectations of their roles were when they were in operational deployment. And you can see that. So for example, a state of tactical awareness that one would expect when one is deployed could translate to being on edge when one is back in the sort of normal world of, as I say, pushing a shopping trolley or going to the newsagent to get the newspapers. Emotional control might translate into detachment and numbness. Individual responsibility for your buddies and what's going on around you might translate as guilt, and there some expectations about the behaviors one would have to undertake in relation to combat operations might translate into risk taking, unnecessary risk taking. So, like I said, these are not diagnostic of something like PTSD, for example, but they do facilitate conversations, and I've found using this from time to time so useful to sort of bring to an understanding and help both ourselves as clinicians and the individual who I'm talking to gain some insight into their experiences. And this applies to both the reservists and the regulars. Next slide, please. And so post-deployment experiences, here's where I just want to make some distinction and why it's so different. And this is time and time again, when I meet the reservists, they tell me about how they experience coming back from deployment very differently. So getting back to civilian life, they're getting into a non-military routine. In fact, I'll have this, if I just use an example, a reservist would tell me that they get back to the camp, in a truck or in a bus, and the regulars who would get off would carry their kit and get back to their barracks, their accommodation, get into their PT kits, maybe chill out, relax in the sort of common rooms, have a chat. The reservists would probably step away from the camp after they've done whatever administration they've had to do, and either wait for an Uber taxi or wait for a bus at the local bus stop to get home, or have someone pick them up to take them home. So very different. You can imagine, being a reservist, being a regular, coming back from deployment. And certainly it was also the experience of many reservists that they were augmentees. In other words, they were often placed into established regular regiments as individuals or small numbers, as opposed to being an entire reservist company or regiment. The partners were not always supportive. It was interesting, and the conversations that I picked up, I mean, there could be tensions because reservists sort of going away from the family, going away from the job that they do on a day basis to take part in military activities. For the regulars, the partners were more likely to support being part of the military family, or dare I say, resign to the life expected of them, husbands and wives and girlfriends and boyfriends, to live the life of their partners. Health stigma, I mean, it's there. I mean, we do our best with all the public health education and mental health awareness, for example, to tackle stigma, and largely, we're doing better, even though the stigma does exist. But it's quite striking that, because of course reservists do not have access to the in-house healthcare in the way that regulars do, the reservist is registered with an NHS GP, like all of us who are not serving regulars in military. They have a preference to be picked up by the NHS than by military healthcare. And what that then translates to is some patchiness in ourselves in military healthcare, being aware of what's going on in medical histories with the reservists as compared with the regular, who, because of their in-house healthcare arrangements, all records are contained within the military confidentiality record systems. So that is something that comes out in the differences in how we look after the reservists as compared to regulars. Next slide, please. And the implications for healthcare practice. As I said, this is sort of continuing the point about reservists being looked after by the NHS GP, potentially by even a mental health trust if they have a mental health problem, may not be known to Defence Healthcare. We would hope the reservists would declare that information to us. We can't compel anyone to do so. We're looking at ways where we make it more acceptable, in the sense that we feel that it's important to be aware so that we can support reservists more comprehensively. But there is that sort of gap in information that we've got to be mindful of. We're mindful also about impact on partners, relationships, the wider family for the reservists, that whereas for the regulars, where there are welfare departments for the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, who can, if they need to, step in to layers with the family of a serving personnel. While some arrangements do exist for reservist units, that relationship and communication may not be quite as robust as it is for the regulars. The communication between reserve forces GPs, we have our reserve occupational health teams that provide for annual checkups for our reservists. And from time to time, we'll do some reviews, especially if reservists present any acute problems to the reserve GP. We're looking to improve those communications, and really a lot of it is very much down to, does the information get communicated? Does the reservist give consent for the information to be communicated from the NHS GP to the reserves healthcare system? And then just a wider point about some of the NHS services that exist. I thought I'd make this an observation and an invitation to, I've saying this many times when I meet with NHS counterparts, improving access to psychological treatments. These are IAP teams and mental health trusts, and particularly independent therapists. Therapists who practice independently, do not belong to an organization like the NHS or an independent sector organization like the Priory, perhaps, that they might operate independently. I'm very keen to encourage that there is good writing up of clinical contacts, and with the permission of the patient, of course, or the client, and sharing that with the NHS GP, because the NHS GP is the sort of the anchor, the sort of central source of medical information. And it'd be hugely important that these therapists can engage in that habit of reporting their contacts, even if it's a summary. That isn't quite happening in a very high level in the UK, and that's concerning. So I just thought I'd flag that point up. So next slide, please. Resilience in recovery. This is really, because, it's so easy for us to sit here and talk about research into the armed forces and say they're unwell and how many people are unwell and what are the consequences of deployment and how unwell do they become. Well, actually, it's also important to stress that there are positives in military service. There are all these experiences that can lead to resilience and the ability to weather adversity, and defining resilience, courage, determination, initiative, integrity. There's camaraderie within military troops. A unique sense of humor is often described. But in relation to engaging clinically with reservists, as indeed with regulars, I'm always keen to promote the idea of a positive mindset rather than adopting the sense of you're unwell, you're vulnerable, you're helpless, what are we going to do? I think a positive mindset goes such a long way, and harnessing some of those positives that come from serving the military are incredibly important. So promoting therapeutic optimism, that is my raison d'etre. Next slide, please. And we have very high profile reservists, actually. I'm sure you're all laughing now if I can't hear you because I can't see the audience. England's men's national football team. I'm bluffing, of course. They're not reservists, but I think it was part of Gareth Southgate's sort of let's boost morale and send them all to boot camp. I think this is several years ago. It might have been just before we got into one of the Euro finals, actually. And you can see none other than Harry Kane himself leading the rush, as it were, with a rather able-looking physical training instructor, PTI, not far behind. But that's the English men's national football team. And no, they're not reservists. Okay, next slide, I think, is wraps me up. Thank you very much for your attention. Over to you, Cam.
Oh, that's super. Thank you so much for that, Jeya. That was really, really interesting. And I'll see if there are any questions in the chat. Yes, quite a few. Oh, no, it's this collapse. So, why did Harry Kane go to Germany then? This wasn't the breaking point, was it?
Yes, he said, no, I can't do this. And maybe he went to Germany, and he probably is a reservist there, no, with our bases there.
Yeah,
we'll
yeah,
never
he's
know.
giving away all the information that we get. Yeah, brilliant. Daljinder, yeah, come in, say who you are and ask your question.
Sure. Thank you so much for that, Jeya. That was really interesting. And having been an ex-reservist myself, I served as a combat medic with the infantry branch down in Portsmouth for 7 years, and I found it really difficult. So it's not a question, it's more sort of just adding to what you shared. I found it extremely difficult to come back into sort of a community setting once I'd sort of like completed summer tours, camps, exercises. And what didn't help was that I wasn't supported in my day-to-day job. So I was at a university at the time, which I'm not going to mention here. But what I found was that being in academia and being a reservist didn't go hand in hand. Academia is not very supportive at all. I found that a real struggle, which is a real shame because you bring in so many skills, not just from a physical perspective, sort of the fitness things to one side, but just sort of leadership, communication, just being confident and having that resilience and having that attitude to, there's no real barriers because there's a way to overcome barriers and obstacles, and you can use that in your everyday life. But I really thoroughly enjoyed my time as a reservist, and again with the health related documentation, so I did end up doing some work for the MOD. I sort of ended up working for the MOD for about 4 years, and again it was so difficult to follow through with traditional NHS notes, especially with new people coming through to the military as well. It was just so difficult to follow that up because they didn't talk, the systems don't talk, do they, in the NHS? But yeah, that's all I wanted to say. So thank you so much.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, we're doing our best. And the point about you make about employers, I know that the MOD is doing a lot more now than it did in the past in the interface with employers
Yeah.
and to sort of meet the employees on a regular basis and encouraging them to acknowledge the sense of participation and support for their employees who are reservists. But it's a work in progress.
Yeah,
Thank
definitely.
you. Over.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Yes. Karishma, do come in and again, turn your camera on, tell us who you are.
Hi, hopefully you can hear and see me. Thank you so much for that, Jeya, really interesting. So my name is Karishma, I'm a postdoctoral researcher in the Forces in Mind Trust Research Centre, delivering the outcome study, which is exploring the benefits and the value of UK military service, which we've been exploring with veterans who've served as regulars. So really interesting. And I kind of want to ask a question about the resilience and recovery stuff that you've noticed or you're trying to promote amongst reservists. So I think you mentioned, some of the recognizing the strengths and encouraging therapeutic optimism and positive mindsets, etc. That's the stuff we're also looking at in the outcome study, and we're starting to see amongst veterans who've served as regulars. So my question here is, have you noticed a difference in this sort of resilience and recovery between those who've served as a regular and those who have served as reservists?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I've not conducted empirical research, so I can't, speak on that basis. But I'm just drawing from my clinical experience because, of course, I see both, and it's quite striking because I think that it's a shame that a lot less is said about the experience of the reservists because they actually bring such refreshing perspectives to the military experience, and which could in fact be very informative and educational for the military at large and indeed for the regulars. But there is this disconnect, unfortunately, between the regular regiments, they're full-time, they're professional personnel who are earning a living, serving king and country, and the reservists are well, in a sense, largely part-time, or and if they're not full-time, a reserve service. So there is that difficulty. The MOD, of course, does have provision around well-being and has resilience teams looking at these areas and developing the sports. But I think what we could build on is the experiences of the reservists and incorporate that. So to hear Forces in Mind Trust doing a piece of work in that, I think could be very promising indeed. Over.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Any other comments or questions? I mean, maybe I can comment if there's no one else immediately. And Edgar, if you wanted to come in and have a speaker conversation, that would be good as well. So I was slightly saddened by Daljinder's experience, and I just wonder why we don't accommodate the skill sets that are so important in our everyday work, in academic work, in clinical services, in so many sectors, really. I don't know what the disconnection is, Jay. I don't know if you have a sense of what it is that we, in our institutional systems, particularly in academia, don't recognize these skill sets. What's going wrong here?
I couldn't speak specifically for academia. I've met reservists who have largely come from engineering, construction industries, those who have worked in retail as well. I do, of course, come across some professionals, a small number of them. They might be, healthcare, they might be teachers or lawyers. I haven't come across an academic, I have to be honest. I haven't come across one myself. From a healthcare point of view, of course, and I'm sure they do exist. So I don't know what that's about, and I think that's an important point, to think about, because I think the MOD is doing its darndest to reach out to employers who employ reservists, and I know that there are some high-profile engineering corporations, some of the big banks and big consultancy accounting firms who have a very positive attitude towards employees who are reservists, and they can see that there's such a richness that's brought to their organizations by virtue of their sense of discipline, their task-oriented approach, their leadership, etc. But I can see Daljinder's come on, so I might want to
please do if you wanted to comment on that. Yes.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I did go through a period where I used to remove that part of my life off my CV. And I'm a psychologist by background. I'm a health psychologist, and I specifically sort of explore sleep, really, but I've got a vested interest in military health, which is why I'm sort of here. I'm really interested in the talks, but and then I just did a sort of mini experiment. I thought, I'm going to actually include this and see how whether I'm getting shortlisted in academic settings. So I did a sort of a bit of a pseudo experiment. And what I did find was that when I removed my military experience, those 7 years, I was getting shortlisted. But when I put the military experience on, I wasn't getting shortlisted. So I don't know. I don't know whether it's something political, whether it's the attitudes. I don't know enough to, sort of gauge in conversation. But it is something really interesting. And like Jeya said, you don't know anything. Sort of,
I was going to say, I'm only speculating here, a worry that you might be absent. By being a reservist, that there are going to be periods of absence, and the employer might be a little bit, apprehensive about employing someone who's going to say, "I'm off for 2 weeks now on exercise." So I don't know, but I just wonder about that.
Absolutely.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you for that. And you'd always be welcome here, Daljinder and colleagues. Anyone who wants to have a further discussion about careers, and we hope to do more work in this area in the future. Mike, last question to you, then I'll just come back to Edgar and Jeya to have any further final communications from them.
Hi, thanks, and thank you, Jeya. Nice to see you again. Hello. I just want to perhaps change the tone slightly and be a little bit more positive. I'm Professor Michael Armand. I did 30 years as an RAF reservist, And if anybody has got any qualms or worries and needs to look at an expert in academia, then I would recommend you Google Professor Vince Connolly, who works at Oxford Brookes, who's done a huge amount of work on reservists. He's a psychologist who's done a huge amount of work on reservists and the integration. He works with the regular army. I think he might have just been promoted to brigadier in Land HQ. And I will say no more, just Google Vince Connolly. And I see somebody here has mentioned the Armed Forces Covenant, but I think there is a narrative which the government has to change about the positive benefits of regular and reserve service and what happens to veterans afterwards. I think there's a huge disconnect, and never before has society been more disconnected from defence, and on a national basis it needs to reconnect. But in terms of reservists and how they integrate with the regular service and how they return to civilian service, please Google Vince Connolly, and he's got loads of stuff out there. That's me.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Edgar, do come in. Jeya, final words. And in the comment, in the chat, there was a question around, Edgar, would you mention the covenant? Do you want to just say what it is for people? And then...
Yeah, the covenant is the sort of government guidelines for serving personnel. It relates to periods in and out of combat. Sometimes I think the covenant has to be, in times of crisis, has to be put to one side, and I don't really think it is directed specifically towards ethnic minority personnel. That it's directed towards the armed forces as a whole. I would certainly support Mike Harmon's view about Vince Connolly. He was our external examiner for 5 years, and he's absolutely the expert to speak on the reservists. And my general view, though, is that the British society, the decline in the military footprint, I think we've now got 148,000 regular troops. Our armed forces, sadly, have become so small that most people just don't have direct contact and that intimate understanding that was present in the 1950s, 60s, and even into the 70s. It's a real shame that our modern society has such a diluted understanding of what the armed forces are about and what their needs are, and the best way to work with them.
Brilliant, thank you. Thank you so much, Edgar, Jeya. Thank you so much for those brilliant presentations. Thank you for everyone for attending and for those incisive questions. All of us continue to do work in this area of war and mental health. And so if people on the call want to get in touch or have ideas for the future, please do. We have the next meeting of this WPA Collaborating Centre series linked to the CHiMES Collaborative on the 20th of March. It's Dr. Tennyson Lee from East London NHS Foundation Trust. He'll be talking about transference focused therapy for personality difficulties, and specifically he's bringing in new notions of effective neuroscience, new concepts of effective neuroscience to help us better understand how to apply clinical interventions and trying to integrate psychoanalytic and neuroscientific ideas. A really challenging topic that he and I have debated for a very long time. So I'm looking forward to seeing you all then. Please tell other people about the seminar. They've just got to register with us, and we can involve you in future conversations, and this will lead to other things. We want to form a community of people who work together and have some critical debate. So final words. Thank you, Edgar. Thank you, Jeya, for some brilliant presentations, and thank you to all of you. I just want to thank Rasheen and Eve in the background who've been doing the tech side and the administration side for organising this so well. See you then, and have a very good evening. Bye bye now.